Well, I'm an interdisciplinary ecologist. I look at systematics, large-scale systems of ecodynamic flux. I've worked in about 100 countries doing field research to examine threats to biodiversity and strategies that realistically might be implemented in one administration or another to endeavor in a collective, compassionate conservation manner to rescue so many creatures from near oblivion. And I'm also a humanist in the sense that I look at the history of ecology, multidisciplinary approaches to compassion and nonviolence, and trying to understand the often blunt, if too rude, intersections between humanity and the natural world, of which, of course, we are but one minute part, notwithstanding our gigantic footprint. So my background comes from comparative literature, philosophy, anthropology, the hard sciences, and biology. I do a lot of work in population and deep demography, and again, the interactions of demographic flux with large-scale regional and local ecosystem dynamics, and have had the good fortune to specialize particularly in mountain regions of the world, but I've worked on every continent and have been tracking calamities inflicted by our species on the natural world since I was a child. So I'm 68 now, so over 60 years of field research. All threats, unnatural threats with respect to unnatural selection in terms of basic evolutionary rubrics, pre- and post-Darwinian rubrics, are really at a bifurcation point and have been for centuries. That is to say, humanity poses and has always posed, down through archaeological records, paleontological records going back tens of thousands of years, we have posed the quintessential threat to biodiversity on this planet. That has been the case ever since the earliest documented Paleolithic forensics, which show our kind herding mass numbers of large ungulates and other mammals over cliffs, for example. We know that we killed in excess, and the megafauna extinction theories that have been discussed relate to the fact that for at least 60, 70,000 years, Homo sapiens and some of our hybrid cousins that coexisted with us 20, 30, 40, 50,000 years ago were deeply immersed in carnivorous behavior, which is not to say we're a carnivorous species. We are now, by and large, of course. But there's great ethnographic and dietary debates with respect to the so-called Paleolithic diet and what our species was actually consuming out of necessity 50,000 years ago. Keeping in mind that's predicated on the theory that Homo sapiens are approximately 315, 320,000 years old. That's it. Well, in the 50 years since there have been Earth Days, it coincides and mirrors a crescendo of passion, conviction, and enthusiasm for impeding the continued infliction of humanity's enormous, inordinate footprint on the planet in every sector, every sector. So Earth Day is a punctuation mark every April that reminds us that it should be a punctuation mark every minute of every waking hour of our lifetimes. We are in an era, an epoch known geologically as the Anthropocene, which coincides with the sixth great extinction spasm in the annals of biology. There's nothing great about it. It just happens to be massive and unending and escalating rapidly. So Earth Day should measure in our psyches and our souls the tally that is occurring right before us, and we are, of course, the species solely responsible for this infliction. So Earth Day is not so much a celebration as a commemoration and an ongoing wake-up call to all of us that if we do not heed common sense and common biological scientific data that is pouring like an avalanche every second from all over the world into our laptops, then we will go extinct as a species. And there are countless counter arguments to Earth Day which suggest that we are now in a near-term extinction event. That is part and parcel of the Anthropocene. So while I would like to smile and say that Earth Day is a great celebratory moment, and it is in the fact that we are alive, we love, we cherish, we reverence nature. In fact, I personally believe that our ability to celebrate nature, like Earth Day, is key to our survival or not as a species. So it's very important. It's a moment in time. It's like the atomic scientist's doomsday clock, which is very close to midnight. And ecologically speaking, we're just seconds away. So Earth Day reminds us of that. Well, it coincided temporally, in terms of 1970, with NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, which took place in terms of its actual debates in Congress and executive signature in the late 60s. And NEPA is now being absolutely ravaged by the Trump administration. You have a lot of ecologists who are shipwrecked, who are struggling to hang on to their positions or have left in disgust and outrage and frustration. Earth Day and NEPA are key indicators of where we've been in the last 50 years. They coincide with much that has happened legislatively in terms of Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, which those three being the largest public landholders in the United States. And all three have very intricate histories steeped in contested legislation, which is all under fire, particularly the Endangered Species Act from 1973 and hundreds of acts that have been pronounced, enunciated, disseminated from state to state, but we still find ourselves, when we reflect on Earth Day, in a situation that is inescapably problematic with respect to the amount of protected areas, the protected corridors, and what each one of us can do within the realm of so-called sustainability, which is a word like love. It almost means nothing at this point. There's, for example, no such thing as sustainable forestry in fragile ecosystems like the neotropics or the boreal forests. So we have to be careful with the way we use our words. But I think, generically speaking, Earth Day is certainly a reminder of all the legislative challenges before us right now. And it also can give us some sense of reassurance that our species, in my opinion, does have what it takes to get it right ultimately at the collective level. That's a broad statement, given that most people that I speak to these days are desperate and almost hopeless and very angry and terribly frustrated and saddened by the distractions geopolitically that are occurring, when we should be putting all of our energy into salvaging the rich biodiversity that still exists on this planet and working collectively to endeavor to resuscitate those species, genera, families, orders that are really on the brink of extinction. And they're everywhere. We're talking about a vast numeric tally of endangerment right now. So Earth Day addresses all of that, and everyone who has his or her respective seat at the table of deliberation and action and activism and compassion is going to relate to it in some form or another, and they must relate to it. Those who don't relate to it, those who are perhaps in a situation like the vast majority of our species is, we're just worried about how we're going to feed ourselves, how we're going to survive. We're basically in that place right now, today, on March 16th, 2020, as America, now in an official national emergency because of a zoonotic transmission from one species to ours, which is now spreading with absolute exponential contagious ferocity, are being awakened to the reality of the interdependency of all species, of economics, of geopolitics, of collective decisions, of bad jurisprudence, of bad organizational skills versus good organizational skills. All of these areas of the human experience have now hit us right in the face, and Earth Day is upon us, another month or so, and we're going to have to sit sit down, take pause, and really reflect societally as to where to from here. I could rattle off all kinds of treaties and situations where we have given ourselves hope. But let's not forget we're narcissists. Our species is a narcissistic, solipsistic, anthropic species. We see it through our eyes, through our lens. And while there has been a vast amalgam of animal rights legislation, of animal liberation and conservation biology and animal protection legislation and agitation by consumers, we're still so far behind what it's going to take to stabilize, let alone improve conditions for the vast majority of large vertebrates. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. Well, biodiversity is simply a measure, a human measure, again, through a human lens, utilizing human metrics that have evolved over centuries of mathematics and physics and natural history to try to get some sense of who our colleagues are, our fellow kindred spirits are on this earth. These biological brothers and sisters of the human species, the numbers are debated as to how many species are out there, why we even demarcate into so-called species or reproductive organisms that can reproduce. The reason it's so critical to us is not just the pollinator services, the $125 trillion estimated dollars worth of annual nature services provided by biodiversity, clean air, clean water, turnover of soil nutrients at a pace and at a rate that will ensure the perpetuation of old forests, new forests, of seedlings. Everyone who has a potted plant on a balcony can understand the different embryological stages of a plant. Well, that plant is not just for our solace, our psychological well-being, which it is, of course, but it is there to soak up carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, to provide oxygen for us. That's why children now learn that the Amazon are the lungs of the earth, that the coral reefs are absolutely critical to the 72% plus oceans that are in fact the earth we live on, the terrestrial portion being less than 30%. All of the elements of biodiversity provide the essential, quintessential biological fundamentals of what gives us the right to be alive. Without it, we'd be dead. Just like ozone. If the oxygen levels differed too dramatically, we'd be gone in a heartbeat. This planet was not a friendly place 2 billion years ago. There was virtually no breathable oxygen whatsoever. We were living in mud and underwater. By the time we came terrestrially to look up at the sun 700-800 million years ago, our predecessors in different forms recognized that evolution, although of course they weren't thinking of it in those terms, I suspect, had given them a new birth. And as a species that is bipedal, that stands, that uses its hands, that is no longer climbing in trees or racing across savannas on four legs, we have been endowed with this incredible biological gift, if you will, of consciousness, which in turn segues into the human conscience. I personally believe all species have a conscience, all species have a consciousness, all species feel pain, many much more so than we do, fish specifically. But biodiversity is the life force that enables us to have this conversation. Anything short of that, we wouldn't be here. And let's, again, not forget, we've only been here for barely 300,000 years. So we're newborns in terms of hominid evolution, in terms of primates. We are newborns. And so it is incumbent upon any newborn to get his and her and its behavior down packed in a manner that coincides with sustainability, that allows us to continue to walk on our own feet, to digest our food, to breathe, to sleep at night, to enjoy the comforts of a loved one, to express friendship, to communicate garrulously, to have a linguistic facility that has empowered our ability to scheme and to dream and to write Hamlet and to create Bach's Passion and to toss frisbees and to make chocolate chip cookies and to do all of those things that we take for granted now as human beings. That's biodiversity. There are numerous indicators that suggest we have the capacity to move in the right direction. I would cite, for example, America's what's been called its best idea, which was the National Park Service, which came into actual official being under Woodrow Wilson as president in 1916. It was called the Organics Act. And since that time, we've created about 419 national park units, about 58 national parks. Some of them are as small as the Indiana's dunes, which are just, a very small amount of acreage. Others are as large as our largest national park, Wrangell St. Elias National Park and Preserve in Alaska, which is well over 13 million acres. We have engendered through great legislative debate and resolve to enshrine such places as the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which approaches 20 million acres. Teddy Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses Grant, Jimmy Carter, who expanded since Earth Day in 1978 by almost double the amount of protected national park areas in the United States, all of it up in Alaska, including Wrangell St. Elias National Park. We have indicated to ourselves and our future human descendants that we appreciate and love nature and wildness. And we have created all kinds of societies, the Wilderness Society, the Audubon Society, Nature Conservancy, and so forth. Thousands of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, dedicated at all costs to protecting precious wilderness, not resources, wilderness, or wildlands, or park areas. And so these are measurable success stories. The World Database on Conservation that works with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature in Switzerland, the IUCN, which utilizes over 11,000 scientists and about 1,200 member nations and non-governmental organizations, working with UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, and other entities around the world, measure how much land and water is protected, which is a very good indicator of the progress we're making. The Convention on Biologic Diversity, based in Montreal, Canada, asks nations, and there are now over 190 of them that are signatories to the Convention on Biological Diversity, and they come up with these action plans to determine how to ensure biological and biocultural heritage, to protect species, to protect corridors linking one protected area with another. All of these can be measured, and we have now measured to the point of about 234,000 protected areas on the planet, which comprises just shy of about 15% of the entire terrestrial Earth is protected. A little over 3% of the marine body of the planet is protected. We're trying to get to what's called the Aichi 11 protocols, which are United Nations indications of how much it would take by 2020, 2030, 2050 to ensure through our protective mechanisms, our umbrellas of protection, that we can actually predict and ensure the proliferation and perpetuation of evolution herself. So the goals are 15% of all oceanic areas and 17% of the planet. There are other indicators that we have followed, like the hotspots methodology, which suggests that if we can protect just under 3% of the highest flowering plant areas of the world, we will ensure genetic viability for the future. We're not there yet. The problem with these metrics, the problem with patting ourselves on the back as a species, is that we really need to be looking at about half the planet if we're going to really talk about ensuring the future of evolution. And that is a very far cry from where we're at presently. Well, when one thinks about measurable successes that our species can take credit for, it's mostly redemptive, biologically speaking. We've managed to recognize the whole concept of endangered species. We've targeted those species greatest at risk, and through very oftentimes just common sense conservation practices, other times more sophisticated with respect to molecular biology and other kinds of genetic research, we have been able to bring back species. We know how to rescue species from oblivion, from extinction. Great examples include, for example, the California condor, whose numbers had gone down to fewer than 30 individuals and now are way over 300. That involved techniques like translocation. Some of them had to be moved from the mountains above Santa Barbara, California, to the Grand Canyon. While there are some tremendous conservation success stories like that of the California condor, whose numbers were under 30 individuals, and through the devoted work of collective conservation efforts in many states, their numbers are now well over 300. There are opposite examples. The Iramote cat in southwestern Japan, numbers fewer than 100. The Mauritius echo parakeet numbers 10 or fewer individuals. The only flightless parrot in the world in New Zealand, which is an iconic species there, the kakapo, Strigops hobriptilus, if you can imagine naming such a gorgeous big parrot, Strigops hobriptilus. But anyway, they're down to about 146 individuals. And New Zealand is absolutely mobilized in an emergency ER effort to save this species, this gorgeous, wonderful species from extinction. So while we have had conservation successes, we're in a desperate mode with species like the Hawaiian crow, for example, just absolutely down to almost nothing. And or Spix macaw, there's just maybe one in the wild, if that. Most of them that survive are in zoos now. So we've got to be careful. We're not at any place where we can pat ourselves on the back. But we do know, as I indicated, how to save species. We know how much it costs in many cases to save species, and we know how to balance a budget in conservation so that we can, although no one wants to use the word, especially these days, triage, but in conservation, we know that there is enough money out there to save every endangered species that exists for anywhere from 50 to 75 billion US dollars per year. We could virtually ensure the safety of every currently listed endangered species on Earth. That's not a big number when you compare it, for example, to the 3.5 trillion or 17% GDP healthcare services currently being expended in the United States for our species. So when we put it in economic perspectives, conservation has done such great work in the last few hundred years, but especially since Rachel Carson and since earlier Teddy Roosevelt and the whole formation of places like the Grand Canyon, Yosemite, Yellowstone. Our species really knows how to do this. We can really make it happen. It's not a ghost. It's not some myth that the world has to go under. We in this generation have what it takes to save most species on the planet. So that gives me great cheer. Everyone is talking about global warming and anomalous climate events, climate change, if you will, greenhouse gas emissions, and what we need to do societally from country to country, working together, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, corporate leadership, to absolutely render the fossil fuel industry obsolete and to ensure that we have a new generation of energy, carbon negative machinery that is no longer, as Leo Marx put it back in 1964 in his book, The Machine in the Garden, quoting Thoreau, but that we become softly treading individuals who can utilize and exploit energy without endangering the planet. But that's just one facet of the crisis ecologically that we're in, and it's not the greatest crisis. It may be to cities that are going to go underwater, for sure, and island nations like the Maldives that are going to go underwater, for sure. But it's not to biodiversity, globally speaking. Global biodiversity loss is the #1 issue on the planet, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many of my colleagues in every country scientifically. But the other aspect, the counterpart of that, is the human population explosion, which is continuing. And that, that deep demographic crisis of over 80 million people being added to this planet every year, multiplied by all the consumer aspirations which we all share and we all want and feel empowered and deserving of. That's what's driving the biodiversity crisis and climate change. But what is not being spoken of very much is the biodiversity crisis. And I would really like to see, especially the youth of this generation, focus deeply on saving wildlife. It's simply not in the media the way it must be. And I'm not sure why that is. People rally around saving a cat who's trapped in a tree. But when it comes to saving a rare feline species on a remote island somewhere in the world, like Iramote in Japan, they don't know about it. They don't want to know about it. It's too much information. It's too depressing. And this is very sad because compassion fatigue is a very debilitating and dangerous issue, and it's probably underlying the rationale for ignoring the biodiversity crisis, which now looms at the level of the 6th extinction spasm in the last 4 billion years of life on Earth. It is what we're up against in this generation. Well, biodiversity is something we should more than care about. Our lives are indebted to it. It's a word, of course, just a word. But it connotes everything that lives and everything that interacts with things like rocks that don't live necessarily, although some Taoists would disagree with that. Everything lives in many religious cultures and traditions. But biodiversity gives us the fundaments for clean air, clean water, soils that produce food, energy that can be recycled with respect to the very basics of photosynthesis, all of the foodstuffs that provide nutrition for our species, and every species is at the heart of nature's services. Services that have been calculated to be worth in human dollars about 125 trillion annually, which is probably a vast underestimate, because how do you value life? How do you value your mother's life, your daughter's life, your own life? You know, courts can put a $5 million value on an individual in some countries. In other countries, it's as low as $300. So when we value biodiversity, we're talking about how do you value your life? And biodiversity is that interconnectivity that absolutely necessarily integrates a human being, an individual, his and her family, into the greater community of life forms. The 7 million follicle mites in our eyelashes, the 26 billion approximate bacteria in our armpits, the 100 trillion cells in our bodies, the tens of thousands of genes in our bodies, they're all connected, and they're all speaking to each other, by the way. And that's not like what are plants saying to each other type of gobbledygook. This is the neurological reality that we now are increasingly beginning to get a handle on with respect to all creatures speaking to each other, or at least communicating in a fashion that enables a tree to know how to bend in the wind, that enables certain fish to know which pools to leap into, which pools not to leap into. It provides guidance and roadmaps for every single organism, and it doesn't culminate in a species called Homo sapiens. We're one of possibly 1 trillion species, if you include bacteria and viruses. If you include just the current formal numeric tally of how many other species are out there, it's well over 8 million. So we're just one of them. And a population of going on 7.8 billion may seem like a lot, and it is a lot when you compound it by the human footprint. But when you look at other species, there are certain, like the bristlemouth fishes, there are trillions of them in the oceans. When you look at a bird in sub-Saharan Africa, the red keelia, there are at least 6 or 7 billion individuals. So we are not the most numerically prolific, but we are certainly the most numerically prolific large mammal, large vertebrate. And the only reason we have gotten to this population number and density and distribution on every continent, including Antarctica, is the fact that we are eating, we're drinking water, we're hydrating, we're sleeping, we have, the vast majority of humans, roofs over our heads. So all of this arrives over 4 billion years of evolution. This is not a hat trick that human beings wield some inordinate power to commandeer the rest of nature. We don't, and we're seeing it now with COVID-19, how vulnerable we are, how vulnerable our systems are to a virus that we know very little about. And so that is a absolute perfect metaphor for how dependent we are, how codependent we are on other life forms, and how vulnerable we all are in the absence of a cohesive, coherent system of life, which we have been granted for the hundreds of thousands of years of our tenure so far on this planet. Well, the discussion of population was a huge issue for the first Earth Day. Remember, in 1968, Paul Ehrlich and a few others, after Paul published his book, The Population Bomb, in 68, which became an overnight bestseller, and a very controversial one because it hit people in a way that they hadn't been hit before, intellectually and morally. They hadn't been challenged quite like that. And so ZPG, or zero population growth, spawned a lot of controversy. It eventually got to the point where people were thinking it was eugenic, it was racist, it was white, superior Aryan races telling the rest of the world how many kids they could have. And this was exacerbated, of course, by the one-child policy in China, which no longer exists, but did for many years, and was the source of so much consternation in parliaments and the U.S. Congress and other bodies around the world that it almost backfired on the population movement because it became such a sensitive issue that since the first Earth Day, most major environmental organizations have been very leery of going there for the actual reality that imperialism by Western powers has been very real historically and has been supremacist and racist and toxic to so many vast other populations on the planet. So we've inherited a bias against open, free, rational, common sense discussions of compassionate population stabilization. People like Bob Gillespie, who's a true luminary in Southern California, has gotten leaders of the world to sign population stabilization declarations, which really entails simply acknowledging that if we hit 8, 9, 10, 11 billion ungainly, largely carnivorous Homo sapiens, that footprint, forget about unsustainable, is absolutely a killer on this earth. And it already is, because even when Paul Ehrlich in 68 made his projections, and then the Club of Rome came in with additional projections, and then the Global 2000 report under the Jimmy Carter administration came up with other population projections. And then finally, Paul Ehrlich and John Holdren, who was President Obama's science advisor in the White House, now I believe he's teaching at Harvard, came up with the so-called IPAT equation, namely impact of the human species equals the population times its level of affluence times the level of technology that it has. I equals PAT. Paul Ehrlich and John Holdren. Brilliant equation. And then you had, also in 1968, Garrett Hardin, a professor at UC Santa Barbara, who came out with his famous article published in Science magazine called The Tragedy of the Commons, in which he explored the notion that if you put farmers around an old English-like commons where everyone has equal rights to graze their sheep, some people are going to cheat. Someone's going to put an extra lamb there in the middle of the night and think, well, one extra lamb's not going to matter. But it does. And eventually you wake up on the 11th hour and you realize that all the grass has been devoured by the sheep. So you add IPAT and the tragedy of the commons, and you look at the 50 years since the first Earth Day and consider where we are on population, and it's little wonder that most countries in the world, the United States included, do not have an official population policy. We're still living in the illusion that a pro-natalist world in which people are free to have as many children as they like is great. And that, as Mao Zedong once said, every child is a precious child. But then they did some econometrics in China, and they realized that they had 100 million more precious babies than they thought they had, and their economists had to lower their GDP by 10%. Economically catastrophic. And that was sort of what precipitated the one-child policy in China. But people don't talk about these things. Most environmentalists don't talk about these things because they get slammed for it. Because whatever I say right now, someone's going to take one way, someone is going to take another way. And ultimately, I'm sitting here right now in a very privileged part of the world, in the Santa Fe Botanic Gardens, here in the capital, one of the oldest capital in America, Santa Fe. And I'm speaking in front of a camera person who has great technology, and we have all of this wonderful mechanical communicative techniques at our disposal, and I'm fully clothed. I know I have a home to sleep in tonight. I hope and I believe. I had a nice breakfast. I've got a pair of shoes. I got pants. I mean, I'm doing okay. And yet there are 900 million people right now who are chronically malnourished. They're not doing okay. And that is an absolutely inexcusable sin committed by our species, that we would let fellow humans suffer that way, that we would engage in misogynist or racist or any other type of economic imperialism that marginalizes our fellow beings, let alone all of that biodiversity I earlier referenced. So population is a delicate, difficult war zone teeming with pitfalls. And words are dangerous because they can be taken either way, and they can be, as we know, cropped and edited and transmuted and transmogrified and perverted into whatever cause one wants to align oneself with. But for me personally, I can speak unambiguously that as an ecologist, 7.8 billion people leaves a footprint that is so unsustainable that there's absolutely no question in my mind that it is the fuel that is destroying the biodiversity on this planet. I think you have to be frank. I think the best way to talk about so delicate a subject as demographics and the human population explosion, which is continuing, 80 million plus per year that we're adding. That's, what is that, about 7, 8 Los Angeleses every year that we're adding to the planet? I mean, do the math. So you have to be frank. We can't tell people what to do. One wonderful aspect of our species is that none of us like authority. We're all very independent-minded. We want to have our freedoms. We take them to be an inalienable right in this country and in most countries. No one wants to be told what to eat, when to eat, who to love, who not to love, who to befriend, who not to befriend, where to go, where not to go. I mean, we all are accustomed to freedom. If only it were so in North Korea, if only it were so in several other nation states. But ultimately, as an ecologist, I want us all to be as free as birds and fish and migratory species that do not acknowledge borders. I personally would love to live in a world, and it's not simply a quixotic ideal, but I really, as an ecologist, believe that watersheds have to be respected and protected, and the movement of individuals and crowds and large numbers of communities have to be respected and allowed to be themselves. So we have millions of nomads on this planet, especially in places like Sudan, where migration is normal for these indigenous cultures. And we can't block them from migration. This is a population issue as well, because obviously it touches upon immigration issues. Well, okay, Smith, you've raised the issue of immigration within the context of ecological migration, which I think is a very smart way to couple two very big ideas that in practice are very complex and have engendered huge consternation in politics, in real human lives every day, in family connectivity, and at the very core of what we take to mean compassion. I'm one of the few people that I know, at any rate, who feels that our borders should be open completely. All borders should be open. Because as an ecologist, I don't really believe in borders. I recognize reproductive barriers biologically, but borders is a human thing. Now, how we go from open borders to managing the commons, which would be the entire planet, is a political question, a question for legal analysis, and obviously global treaties. One of the problems with an open border concept, such as I would postulate biologically, is the fact that right now we have approximately 500 major international environmental treaties, but we have no overarching body or government body to manage all those treaties, to ensure those treaties are being paid attention to, monitored, policed. And so when you talk about open borders, I'm actually throwing open one of the hardest questions of all. I think from a biological perspective, that by opening our borders and welcoming anyone who wants to come into this country and opening borders in every other country of the world, you would see a rebalancing, a retooling ecologically that would put the future generations in a spellbinding situation of great opportunity. It would unburden high biodiversity areas like the Yucatan if people who reside there woke up tomorrow and decided, I'd like to give a shot at living in the United States. The Yucatan is one of the high biodiversity areas of the planet. Most of Mexico is. And so we're seeing a crossword puzzle between biological imperatives and human imperatives. And right now, sadly, in my opinion, the tendency is toward this insulation movement. We're closing down. We're relying on borders to keep others away from us. We're doing it right now because we're in a pandemic, of course. But under more normal circumstances, 3 weeks ago, 6 months ago, we weren't worried about keeping social distance. In fact, we were embracing it. We were seeing hundreds of thousands of people in stadiums. We're looking forward, perhaps, to the Tokyo Olympics, where you'll have hundreds of thousands of people. We are a gregarious species. So the fact that we would have created borders, well, we could go on in terms of evolutionary theory and geopolitical history, why that happened. And I'm not simply dreaming when I suggest that borders should be open. But I think the reality would be astonishing if we opened our borders and got rid of this absolutely heinous debate over who should be here and who shouldn't be here, over the word foreign, over the word alien. These are terrible, dirty words. We're one family, our species, and we are one member of a huge biological community. And yes, His Holiness the Dalai Lama once told me that we have to really start by micromanaging our own backyard before we can presume to manage larger spaces like the community, like the region, like the state, like the United States. And that is, of course, the very basis for the Greek definition of ecology, which is really housekeeping, to manage and take care of and keep clean your own home, your own backyard. So yes, we have to be responsible for ourselves. But to answer your question about borders and immigration and migration, species don't acknowledge borders. I will remember going back and forth across the border between San Diego and Tijuana, this maelstrom of teeming, madding human crowds, agitated, fearful, angry, annoyed, frustrated, harassed. And I'm looking overhead at seagulls just traversing the skies back and forth over that border. And I'll never forget that impression of the freedom of the birds. And I contrast that with the exact opposite, which was a true scientific and emotional epiphany for me personally. When I was 3 years old at the San Francisco Zoo, my dad took me one foggy morning, and there I was standing as a 3-year-old looking at a Canada gray wolf in a cage. And the animal was exhibiting stereotypies, this pacing back and forth, this psychotic desperation of a caged animal. And I remember looking up to my dad and asking him, "Dad, what is going on? Why is this gorgeous wolf in jail?" And I remember my father, William Tobias, looking down at me and saying, "Welcome to the world, kid." Well, I've been fighting against that world ever since. I truly believe in no cages, no borders, total freedom, the population issue, human rights, animal rights. I insist on myself, and I insist on the rights of all others to be themselves. And that includes every species on this planet. I mean it. I'm very serious about it. I have a deep, perhaps I'm too emotionally connected to every creature that I see. But I am, and my wife is. And together we've spent our lives devoted to animal liberation, and that means liberating humans and liberating that wolf from that cage. And so when you ask me about borders, you're asking the wrong person, because I don't believe in them, and I don't think ecology believes in borders. We've been living with pandemics ever since we were birthed as a species. Hominid evolution is filled with pandemics. We have evidence, for example, of a pandemic in 13th, 14th century, what is Tibet, that resulted in huge mortality from stomach cancers. Let's not forget the Black Plagues, the 1918 influenza, which took out several of my relatives. We've lived with pandemics and transmission of diseases between species. I did a film with Howard Lyman based on his book Mad Cowboy some years ago that looked at the prion and mad cow disease, or new variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which was horrifying and killed people at all ages, but had an incubation period of 40, 50 years, so many people would outlive eating a hamburger and potentially dying from that hamburger, which is what the story was that Howard Lyman wrote in his true tale called Mad Cowboy. So we've been living with pandemics. What really frustrates me, aside from the sheer sorrow that I feel for all of us having to deal with this, for my own mother, who lives just a few blocks from where I'm sitting, and at age 95 and a half is terrified right now. Terrified to see me or my wife Jane to come over and visit and bring her food. Where did we get the food? Have we been wearing gloves? Did we clean down our steering wheel? All of these basic issues that most people have lived with for most centuries. They just perhaps were not so aware of the level of risk. And with social media, of course, it's in our face now 24/7, every second of the day. The alerts are going off. The latest school closure, the latest new draconian impact on our lives and the lives of our friends and loved ones and the economy, needless to say. But pandemics are not new. What I think is perhaps least discussed right now, and I can understand why, is that this is a tragic distraction, geopolitically and medically, at a national and international level and an economic level, from what we should be doing to preserve the planet. So every dollar that we're now throwing in emergency funding, which we have to do, we're a humane species, thank God, but that money is not going to save other species. And this is where it really comes down to what you've noted journalists are really hesitant to talk about, which is battlefield triage. and conservationists are loath to speak about triage because we want to believe that we can save every species. But right now, we're doing a terrible job at saving our own species. And by that, I don't mean just right now, today, because of COVID-19. Remember to hearken back to the population bomb that Dr. Paul Ehrlich at Stanford wrote in 1968. People thought he was crazy. People thought he was exaggerating and hyperbolic. But at the time he wrote that, we were living in Malthusian times. We had over 1 billion people who were starving to death when he wrote that book. He wasn't exaggerating. He had his data absolutely, precisely right. In fact, he was understating the case. And if you consider that in 1945, when the United Nations was founded, 75 years ago, it's the anniversary, there were 2.5 billion people on this planet. They'd suffered pandemics. Remember, again, 1918 killed 25, 30, there's debates medically, 35 million people. So that was influenza. So right now, this is not only a new form of virus, but at the moment, it seems to be a rather non-aggressive virus, notwithstanding everything we're seeing in terms of the exponential and logarithmic numbers rising by the day. But consider what happened during the Black Plagues, the waves of Black Plagues in the Middle Ages. The world lost 1/3 of the human population between England and Iceland. It's not a long distance. 1/3 of the human population was wiped out by the Black Plague. It was caused, probably, more than likely, by a zoonosis, a contagion from a rodent or cluster of rodent species. Black rats, Norwegian rats, coming in contact with humans whose sanitation in those days was certainly not up to what we'd consider normal today, but in fact is normal amongst the 7, 8, 900 million people who have been suffering all along. I mentioned from malnourishment, from chronic malnutrition. So I see COVID-19 not only as a human tragedy, which it is. My friends in Tuscany right now are truly suffering. My friends in Spain, we just heard from, they're desperate. We have friends all over the world. We all have friends everywhere and loved ones who are being affected by this, because we're all being affected by it. But can you imagine what's going to happen if the human population continues unabated? We hit 10 billion people. We're living in megacities of 50, 60, 70 million people. We are basically creating petri dishes for the expansion and explosion of new forms of viruses as we wipe out biodiversity, as we encroach upon forests, as we destroy coral reefs, as we destroy the Amazon, the great tropical midriff of the planet from the Congo to Indonesia to West Africa. And as species are being squeezed out, what we're really doing is genetically squeezing out the biodiversity, homogenizing those genes, and creating a breeding ground in these future megacities, which will comprise more than 80% of the planet, with between 8 and 12 billion people, certainly 9.5 billion, which is the conservative estimate. We are right now seeing just a bubble bursting. Wait until it's not a bubble. Wait until it is a whole continent that bursts. So I don't want to be a prophet of doom, but I think COVID-19 is an ecological wake-up call that's been waiting to happen, and I'm not happy it has. I'm tragically upset that it has happened. But if there's any bright spot in all of this, maybe we will start to come together more rationally, more civilly, more empathetically, and love one another in a way that is more contagious than we could ever hope for in terms of spreading that same love to other species. That is my wish. One of the areas of research that I've been personally involved with for going on 50 years now is the matrix of sustainability behavioral patterns in different communities and nation states that are positive from an ecological perspective and from a humanistic perspective. There are very few countries, in my opinion, that actually demonstrate a nationwide observance of nonviolence and ecological sustainability. And one of those places is the Kingdom of Bhutan in the easternmost Himalayas. I've been working there since 1974, and our Dancing Star Foundation has been engaged there on various levels with the government to not only help ensure the perpetuation of indigenous peoples who live in what is largely an agrarian country of 750,000 people, but who are largely Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, nonviolent devotees. And they developed years ago a replacement for our normal accounting practices of gross domestic processes, and they came up with something called GNH, gross national happiness, not gross national product. And GNH has really caught on in countries around the world in accounting practices that incorporate natural capital depreciation and take that into account when they do their economic annual budgets, when they do their quarterly reports at every level of government. Gross national happiness. So Bhutan is a country that is largely vegetarian, that really practices what it preaches as a Buddhist nation. I've been deeply impressed by Bhutan, and we've just finished what we call an assessment of conservation priorities for Bhutan, where a group of about 15 technical experts and 50 others in the field have come together during the last year to assess every sector of Bhutan's economy and understand what it's going to take for Bhutan to continue to keep over 60% of its primary forests intact, which it has managed to do, to maintain the largest and most robust population of Asian tigers and many other species. Bhutan is really at the cutting edge, and sadly, Bhutan is the downstream unhappy beneficiary of climate change because the glaciers are melting, and our expectations are that in the next 10 to 15 years, 70% of all the glaciers in Bhutan will melt. That's serious on so many levels, I wouldn't know where to begin to start. But economically, it's going to hit the country very hard because her major foreign revenue source comes from the sale of hydropower to countries like India and Bangladesh due south. So when all those waters flood and all those glacial lakes overflow and demolish village after village, it's going to be catastrophic for countries like Bhutan. One other country I would mention is Suriname. Northern tip of South America. All her water is flowing north into the Atlantic. She borders Brazil and French Guiana and Guyana. And she has managed to protect almost 90% of her forests. Part of this, again, is she has a very low population, about 530,000 people. But it is Suriname and Bhutan are two brilliant templates for ecological governance, which I would urge all of your viewers to look at and examine under a microscope, because these are two countries that are getting it right. I would really like to see the number of vegetarians and vegans increase. It's no surprise to me that the former head of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Group on Climate Change, himself came out, Dr. Pachauri, some years ago, and advocated for vegetarianism worldwide. It's no mystery that Leonardo da Vinci, Percy Shelley, so many other luminaries throughout artistic and scientific history were devout vegetarians. So the one thing I believe that you can do that costs you nothing, that takes no additional energy, that you can do in the privacy of your home, with your family, around the dinner table, on the job, in the products you purchase, I would urge everyone to at least experiment with vegetarianism, as Mahatma Gandhi did. I think that would be probably the number one ecological conflict resolution manifesto that the entire world could embrace, and it would, at the same time as cutting down on global warming, it would be the one thing you can do to alleviate suffering on this earth. Because let us not forget that the largest pain points, as Jane Morrison and I called it in our book, God's Country, the New Zealand factor, the largest amount of suffering is aggregated in slaughterhouses, amongst the tens of billions of chickens that are being slaughtered every day. And when you add up all the data coming in from Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN to 50 other data banks that we study every day, we are killing between 2 and 4 trillion animals every year for our pleasure. That's including all the fish all the mammals, all the vertebrates, all the birds, all the roadkill, the poaching, all the consumption on our dinner tables, all the purchasing of leather, and still people purchasing fur and other products from animals. So that would be the biggest step that you could take if you truly want to be an ecologist. Experiment with vegetarianism and veganism. Well, if Andrew here is going to stop on his way back to Albuquerque at the Leonora Curtin, C-U-R-T-I-N, it's on the Santa Fe Botanic Garden website. It's one of the few cienagas or marshlands in the Southwest. We've been in a long-term project with the Santa Fe Botanical Gardens, we being the Dancing Star Foundation, to understand the impact of climate change on cienagas, on marshlands, on wetlands, and also to identify the biodiversity that exists there. And we did what we call a bio-reverie last fall, where we had the public come out, kids and school groups came out, there were experts there, botanists, entomologists, ornithologists, microbiologists with microscopes looking at species and identifying new ones. And in that one 12-hour stretch that the public took part in, under the aegis of the Santa Fe Botanic Gardens here in Santa Fe, they found over 600 species. And we call it a bio-reverie. I did one in Georgia a couple of years ago, in Milledgeville, Georgia. In fact, you can find the film online. It's just called bio-reverie, one word. And I think Andrew will probably be wandering to the banks of the pond there, and he'll see some of the largest cottonwood trees in the United States there. It's quite a gorgeous place. Only 38 acres, but it's very precious. And the Leonora Curtin wetland embodies that sort of local microcosm that really touches upon the core of what we've been discussing here, and that is you can make a difference. Individuals on a small piece of turf can get involved, can fall in love with a tadpole, with a bullfrog, with a cottonwood tree, with a little bug in the soil that they have no idea what it is, but they can find out if they want, or they don't have to find out. You know, we don't have to denude every mystery. Mystery is a good thing. We don't have to catalog and understand every species. I like mystery. So that's a gorgeous place, and it represents an ongoing project now, both for the state of New Mexico and for the Santa Fe Botanic Garden, which is very important, and it's representative of community commitment and community conservation at the local level. And it also really embodies how critical the scientific understanding of impacts of climate change and biodiversity is. We have to learn more, we have to do more research, and everyone needs to be involved. Conservation is community conservation, or it's nothing. We all have to take part in it. So it's a very good icon for a community that's committed to a small piece of land, and the water there has been flowing from the mountains behind me, which is the Sangre de Cristo Range, the Southern Rockies. It's taken about 10,000 years for that water to migrate those 25 miles from the mountains to that marsh that Andrew will be able to photograph. And very important place. And it was a sacred place for the indigenous peoples who have always lived here.